We've heard it all before, haven't we? The Catholic Church is the enemy of science, progress, and reason. Well, it's all nonsense, and we're going to debunk it mercilessly. Join me right now for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm your host, Thomas Woods. I'd like to begin this 13-program series with a fact that's fairly obvious to most of us. There's a bit of a double standard in the world when it comes to the Catholic Church. You can say anything you like about the Catholic Church, your career won't be over, no one will care, there'll be no candlelight vigils or hunger strikes. You say anything you like about it, and that's just fine. If anything, you'll be even more welcome in fashionable circles than before. So, what's the result of that? The result is that you can get away with saying the most absurd, ludicrous things about the Catholic Church. And people believe it. People are inclined to believe every ridiculous calumny against the Catholic Church. But worse still, some Catholics themselves, I think, have begun to interiorize some of these criticisms. And deep down, I think they themselves wonder, has the Church really been a positive influence in history, after all? Hasn't she been responsible only for repression and ignorance? And hasn't she been an opponent of the sciences? We've all been taught to believe this. It would be a miracle if people didn't believe it. But it's not true. And in this series, we're going to show why it's not true. And we're going to show the true glory of the Catholic Church. Now, the attacks on the Catholic Church and on religious belief in general have accelerated just over the past 5 years or so. We've already seen in recent years, best-selling books by Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris condemning religious belief in general as irrational and foolish, and in effect they're saying to children in this country, your parents are stupid for teaching you the faith. Worse than that is that after the July 7th, 2005 bombings in London, what we began to see is this trend, that Islamic terrorism is now giving intellectuals an excuse to oppose all religion. The argument being that all religion is irrational, all religion can give rise to violence, so it should all be condemned. So, for example, in Scotland's Sunday Herald, we read Muriel Gray saying, "The cause of all this misery, mayhem, violence, terror, and ignorance is, of course, religion itself." And she called religion Dark Ages nonsense. For the government of a secular country such as ours, she said, to treat religion as if it had real merit, instead of regarding it as a ridiculous anachronism, which education, wisdom, and experience can hopefully overcome in time, is one of the most depressing developments of the 21st century. Now, I'll leave aside the fact that she doesn't know how to use the word hopefully correctly. That's another matter. The point is, this is our critic. Another critic, Polly Toynbee in the London Guardian, said, "It is now time to get serious about all religion and draw a firm line between the real world and the world of dreams." In the London Spectator, Matthew Paris said, "What unites an extremist mullah with a Catholic priest or evangelical Protestant minister is actually much more significant and interesting than what divides him from them." Well, these criticisms have become routine. Day in and day out we hear them. All religion is the enemy of progress. But the Catholic Church in particular is consistently viewed as the enemy of science and progress and knowledge. Consistently. Now, why is that? How did that happen? In part, it began 200 years ago or more in the so-called Enlightenment, which was a period in 18th century European history in which the intellectual classes became extraordinarily hostile to the Church. They disparaged the Middle Ages consistently. In fact, that's why they had the word Enlightenment. Because the idea was that before the Enlightenment, before the wonderful 18th century, all we had was misery and backwardness and ignorance fostered by the Catholic Church. But now, thankfully, we have secular intellectuals to bring us enlightenment. I sometimes think that the most depressing job on earth must be to be a history professor who teaches about the Middle Ages. Must be the most depressing job on earth. All day long, you lecture about the Middle Ages, and you say, the Middle Ages weren't so bad. In fact, a lot of great things happened in the Middle Ages. Catholic Church made a lot of great things possible. You lecture on this all day long. You write books and articles on it. You even appear on television. You appear on radio, and you talk about it. And what happens? You get home at night, you turn on the TV, nothing you've done has made any effect. Everybody still believes the Middle Ages was a time of ignorance and repression, and it was all the fault of the Catholic Church. All of that stuff, in effect, cannot be dislodged. It must be extremely depressing. Now, why are these falsehoods so resistant to the truth? Why is it so hard to get people to change their minds on this? Well, ever since the Enlightenment, what has taken root in our culture and in our way of thinking is that the Catholic Church is assumed to be wrong, and that secularism, that is the idea of organizing society and all of life without reference to God, that is said to be the source of progress. So by definition, anything the Church is connected to involves retrogression, whereas anything that a secular intellectual brings us, well, that brings us progress. And that has been the lens through which history has been viewed over the past 200 years. That's why it's only over the past maybe 50 years that we've begun to see historians finally cracking through this nonsense and finally saying, wait a minute, not only did the Catholic Church not obstruct the sciences, she may have helped to foster them. Not only did secularists not invent the science of economics, for example, but in fact it turns out it was Catholic priests and professors who developed the ideas of economics centuries earlier, and on and on and on. But it's taken a long time to crack through this accepted idea that the Church is responsible for retrogression and ignorance. It's taken forever. Now let's think about some of these areas in which the Catholic Church has really built our civilization. I mean, I choose that word advisedly. Why is it that the Catholic Church can be said to be her builder? Well, for example, consider how we think about charity, charitable work. We think that you're engaged in charity when you help somebody without any expectation of a reward, when you do it because it's good and it's right to do it. You do it because you know that in the grand scheme of things, that unfortunate person is in some sense your equal, having been made in the image and likeness of God. And so you help that person. You don't help that person because you expect 3 years down the road to revisit him and say, remember that $15 I gave you, why don't you cough it up? Or to revisit him and say, I need votes, I need some political support, why don't you come help me? We don't do it so we can tell the whole world, hey, look at what a great guy I am, I just gave that guy $10. We don't do it for those reasons. We do it for the reasons that I gave, purely disinterested motives. Well, where do we get that idea? That idea comes from the Catholic Church. Because in ancient Greece or Rome, if you had said, oh, I'm going to go help somebody with no expectation of any reciprocity, I'm just going to go do it out of the goodness of my heart, they would have thought you were crazy. What are you talking about, man? Much less the idea that I would pray for and even try to help my own enemies. What are you, insane? But yet today, we take this for granted as the ideal, that the good man tries to observe these principles. But again, where do they come from? They come from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church teaches this about charity. The ancient world didn't. So here's an area in which things that we take for granted, this is the way we think, we take it for granted. Where does that come from? It comes from the Catholic Church. We'll have more to say about that in a future episode. How about the idea of rights, that I have a right to own property, or a right not to be killed, for example? Where does that idea of rights come from? Well, we've always been told that secularists in the Enlightenment, or just before the Enlightenment, came up with this idea in the 17th century. All of a sudden, boom, rights just developed. Well, that's not true either. And once again, modern research is coming to the rescue of Catholicism. I know that sounds odd. You think modern researchers, you want to run the other way. But in fact, honest professors, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, are now saying that the idea of rights goes all the way back to the 12th century and Catholic canon lawyers who gave the idea its birth. And the idea of a right simply means that I have a certain immunity to invasion by you. You can't just arbitrarily kill me or deprive me of my property, things of this nature. That's all a right is, that it would be wrong for you to interfere with me in these areas. And where does this liberating idea come from? From the heart of the Church. Or again, economic science. Did Adam Smith just think of economics in the 18th century? It all just came out of his head. He had this gigantic head, and all of economics just poured out of it. No. In fact, for the past 50 years, what have historians been saying? They've been saying that it was the Catholic scholastics, professors who taught in particularly Spanish universities, and specifically the University of Salamanca, that gave birth to modern economics. They were the founders of economics, not secularists of the Enlightenment. This is now being discovered. On the wall of my office, I have a framed picture of the University of Salamanca. Now, most people would come in and say, "What's the matter with you, man? Why would you, of all universities, pick this one?" It's because I know that this is where economics was given birth. And if you're a geek like me, you're very interested in, you love economics. But then finally, for right now, before our break, what about our commitment to reason? Don't we always pride ourselves in Western civilization on our commitment to the use of reason? That we use human reason to resolve disputes and to settle debates? Well, of course. But where does that come from? Where does that come from? That also comes from the Catholic Church. Why? Because the university system that the Catholic Church fostered encouraged debate, rigorous debate. And human reason was held up as the great arbiter to decide all these matters that are up for debate. Again, isn't that the opposite of what you're told? What we're told is that the Catholic Church is an enemy of reason. To the contrary, there has been no greater champion of reason. But it's not just reason. It's more specific applications of reason. For example, the sciences in particular. The sciences, more than we realize, owe themselves to the Catholic Church. Now, why is that? It's the opposite of what we're told, but believe it or not, historians of the past 50 years have begun to say the Catholic Church is more and more responsible for the sciences. Come on back and we'll talk about this after the break. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Before the break, we were talking about all these areas in which the Catholic contribution to our civilization has been indispensable, but in which it's largely neglected. How many of the facts that we've uncovered even up to now are covered in schools on a regular basis? Do I even have to ask that question? But I teased you a little bit with the idea of the Catholic Church as having helped to give birth to science in Western civilization just before our break here. What did I mean by that? Well, I'm going to tease you a little bit again, because by next time we're going to get into the sciences in real depth, the next 3 episodes, in fact, because here I think we have the aspect of Catholic history that is most often mangled and distorted, and most often used, I think, as a bludgeon with which to beat the Church over the head. And I want to show that this is largely without merit. What I at least want to tell you for now is that it really is true that over the past 50 years, scientists who write the history of science have begun rethinking the old arguments against the Church and said, you know what, on second thought, the Church actually did very important things. There's a reason that science took root and then was sustained for so long in Western civilization, whereas it wasn't in others. And this, it turns out, is not in spite of the Catholic Church, but in some ways because of it. Now, 100 years ago, it's true, you would have read a book by Andrew Dixon White, called, that refers to the alleged warfare between religion and science in Western civilization. Today, White's book is considered almost laughable among professors. It's so out of date and so ludicrous. Today, you have professors like Edward Grant writing Cambridge University Press books. You've got Thomas Goldstein, A.C. Crombie, David Lindbergh, and many besides. And what they all agree on is that you can't just say the Church was an opponent of the sciences. To the contrary, there were aspects of Catholic thinking that were indispensable for the development of science. And we're going to get into specifically what were those. But right now, I want you to know that this old myth is being overturned by professors. Unfortunately, the findings of these professors have not managed to trickle down to the general public yet. This is what we're going to try to do on our series. Let me give you, by the way, an example of a typical story that people have been taught to believe about the Catholic Church, and then consider why it is they so readily believed it when there isn't even a stitch of evidence for it. And here's an example that I think even many people in the viewing audience might have believed, that I myself believed. I have no reason to think otherwise. And that's the idea that Christopher Columbus, when he engaged in his famous voyages, was actually seeking in part to prove that the Earth was not flat, but rather spherical. Now, we've all heard the usual story, that Columbus was warned. No, Columbus, no, don't go sailing that far. You're going to fall off the edge of the Earth. Don't you know that? The Earth is a big flat disk, and you're going to fall off the edge and get eaten by dragons, or giant radioactive spiders are going to eat you, something like that. He was warned about all this. Don't do it. Well, he did it anyway, and this goes to show how brave and wonderful he was. Now, I don't dispute that Columbus was indeed a brave and skilled navigator. But Columbus himself, were he here today, would tell you that he was not seeking to prove the Earth was spherical. Why? Because everybody already knew it. Everybody already knew the Earth was a sphere. In effect, no educated person in Europe believed the Earth was flat. That is a myth. That's an almost absurd myth. In fact, just try to go back and find anybody in the history of Christendom who believed in a flat Earth. Just look for them. If everybody believed it, that shouldn't be so hard. And yet you can't find any examples. Well, I correct myself. You can find two examples of people you've never heard of. Lactantius, for example, from the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. He had no influence on anybody, and in any event, he was speaking more allegorically than anything else. The other person who seems to have believed it was a 6th century figure named Cosmas Indicopleustes. You ever heard of him? Neither have I. And neither had anybody in Western Europe. Cosmas wrote in Greek. By the time you get to that period of time, hardly anybody in the West speaks Greek. Pope St. Gregory the Great, for instance, who was Pope from 590 to 604, already he doesn't even speak a word of Greek. So hardly anybody could have read Cosmas. He wasn't translated into Latin until 1706. So anybody who may have taught a flat Earth had an audience of about 1 or 2 people, had no influence on anybody. The fact is, everybody understood the Earth was a sphere. The reason people were reluctant to sponsor Columbus wasn't that they were afraid he was going to fall off the edge. The reason they were afraid to do it was that they thought he had very much underestimated the size of that sphere. Columbus was saying, oh, don't worry about it. It's not a very big Earth. I'll just sail right around. I'll be right back. It'll be fine. But they were saying to him, no, the Earth is several times larger than you think it is, and you're just going to starve to death. You're going to sail, and you're going to sail, and you're going to sail, and you're not going to be any land. Well, luckily for Columbus, a couple of continents managed to spring up, quite contrary to his expectation, and thankfully for him and for his crew. But that was why they didn't want him to go. It wasn't because they thought he was going to fall off the edge. Now, I realize that is so much the opposite of what you've been told. You almost think that I must be making this up, right? Sure, people believe in a flat Earth, but I promise you they didn't. And there's actually a whole book that was written to answer the obvious follow-up question. If nobody believed in a flat Earth, how did this myth ever get started? And the answer comes in a small book by a guy named Jeffrey Burton Russell. He wrote a book called Inventing the Flat Earth. And what he found was that it was a very, very tiny group of intellectuals in the 19th century who gave birth to this myth. And they did it because it made the Catholic Church look ridiculous. Because it made the Catholic Church look ridiculous. Because in the 19th century, there was a lot of debate and dispute with the Church about Darwin and other matters. And the idea was that if we can portray the church as being so ridiculous that it used to actually teach the earth was flat, then we can show that she is an utterly contemptible opponent. So they invented this story to cast the church in an absurd, ridiculous light. I am sure they had no idea the longevity of this myth, that in the 21st century people would still be taught it. I'm sure somewhere in the world right now as I speak, somebody's being taught the stupid church taught the earth was flat and brave, heroic Columbus proved them wrong. It just won't go away. But why won't it go away? Why does it have such staying power? And the reason is that it feeds into this Enlightenment stereotype, right? The Catholic Church is stupid, it inhibits progress, it forces us to believe foolish things. Well, that's exactly what we see in the flat earth myth, isn't it? Who could possibly believe the earth was flat? The ancient Greeks actually measured the circumference of the earth. So obviously they knew it was round. How could the foolish church think anything different? So there's a great example that can easily be overturned. But it hasn't been overturned because it serves a purpose. If you tried to invent some myth today about any famous person you could think of and say that so-and-so believed such and such, it would last for about 3 seconds. But people believe what they are prepared to believe. And people are prepared to believe the worst about the Catholic Church. So the point of the series, the point of the next 12 weeks in which I'll be joining you, is to go after not simply these little myths, but to build up an edifice to show the glories of the Catholic Church. Not simply to say, well, the church didn't really do this, or the church wasn't really so bad over here. We're not going to make any progress if our message is, the Catholic Church, not as bad as you thought. We need something a little more vigorous, a little more vigor in our message. We need instead to say, it's not simply the Catholic Church isn't as bad as you thought, or she didn't really teach the earth was flat. We can't win by always running around putting out fires. Nobody ever built a house by putting out fires. Fires have to be put out, it's true. But we understand that we can't build if that's what we're always doing. If we're always letting opponents of the church define the debate for us, then we're always going to be on the defensive. And it seems to me, given the state of our civilization, that it's about time that we went, shall we say, on the offensive. And we showed people all the glories of the church, and we showed them all this hidden history. So we don't have to say, oh, we're not really as bad as you think. We're far more glorious than we ourselves even realize. And we are going to be up against, well, frankly, very, very influential people in this world. I'm sure many of you remember that the European Union's Constitution excludes all mention of the Christian influence on Western civilization. How willfully blind would you have to be, surrounded by cathedrals and religious artwork and the fruits of what the church has given us? How blind would you have to be not to mention that the church had a little something to do with building this civilization? No. Instead, the European Union Constitution begins and ends with the idea that Western civilization, that comes to us from ancient Greece and Rome, and then from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And that 1,000-year period in between, well, I don't know what was going on. Apparently nothing much. That's the standard view, and that was the standard view many people had up until, as I say, as recently as 50 or 100 years ago. But today, any medieval historian worth his salt knows this is a whole lot of nonsense and would reject it with a laugh. But yet, the architects of the European Union exclude mention of the church or of Christ from their founding document. It isn't that they're stupid. If it were just a matter of stupidity, that would be easily overcome. We just come back with the facts and that'll be the end of it. It's that they're hostile to the church. I mean, what could be more obvious than that? Look at what the European Union is up to half the time. Do they seem like pious Catholics, most of these people? They have no interest in spreading the truth about the church. And that's why we as Catholics are under a particular obligation. We have to learn what we can about our faith. And we have to go and spread it. And we have to go and tell people the real history of the Catholic Church, because if we don't defend ourselves, nobody's going to do it for us. I actually wrote a book called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, because I thought it was about time that we told our story. And that's what I'm going to spend the next 12 episodes doing, is telling our story. But for next time, we're going to start 3 programs on the subject of the church and science. And you're going to have more ammunition than you're going to know what to do with by the time we're done with the next 3 episodes. Because did you know, for instance, that the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, did you know that they were so accomplished in the sciences that right now 35 craters on the moon are named after Jesuit scientists? Did you know that 1 out of 20 of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived belonged to the Society of Jesus? Or that the Jesuits helped to found and then became the greatest practitioners of the study of earthquakes, seismology. And we can go on and on and on. Atomic theory, the study of ancient Egypt, the study of physics, and I can go on and on. There are so many ways in which the Catholic Church contributed to the sciences. So join me next time for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Everyone learns in school that the Catholic Church was the big enemy of science. Well, you know who doesn't believe that anymore? Professional historians of science. Join me today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization, and we'll learn the truth. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. It comes as a surprise, doesn't it, to learn that the Catholic Church may have had a positive role in the development of science, right? Because we're all taught from birth the exact opposite. In school, in the media, in movies, scientists are always brave martyrs against the ignorant church that wants to suppress their findings. Well, you might be excused for this view if you lived 100 years ago, because then the dominant book on the subject was written by a fellow named Andrew Dixon White. I mentioned him in our first program because he wrote a book called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. This became the defining volume on this subject. But it is full of nonsense. In fact, it turns out that in White's book, you actually read that the Catholic Church taught that the earth was flat. Now, we saw last time there is not the tiniest stitch of evidence for that. But White, anxious to portray the church as silly and backward and ridiculous, simply repeated what other historians had said without bothering to investigate it. That was the quality of his book. Since then, White's book has been so dramatically overturned that you'd think we'd be reading something about it. We'd hear, hey, the Catholic Church, after all, played an important role in the sciences, but instead, we hear only crickets. There's no real anxiety, there's no anxiousness to get to the truth in this matter. I wonder why that is. Well, there are a lot of modern historians who, unlike Professor White, are still alive and who are doing work right now and who have concluded that, in fact, the Church has played at least some kind of positive role, and some scholars even go so far as to say that the Church had certain ideas that were indispensable to the development of science. That's the opposite of what we hear, right? But you have scholars saying this all the time. Thomas Goldstein, Toby Huff, A.C. Crombie, Edward Grant, David Lindbergh, Professor Heilbronn at Berkeley, and many others. So what are they saying? And how dare they say this? Don't they know the Catholic Church is nothing but an oppressor of the geniuses of the world? Well, let's look at some of the claims that these new historians are making. And by the way, they are not all Catholic. Some are Catholic, some aren't Catholic. I've deliberately gone out of my way to consult historians of science who are non-Catholic, some of whom are even anti-Catholic, in order to show that this is for real. This isn't a bunch of Catholics writing some books to make the church look good. This is the consensus among professionals today. Now, one of the most important principles that the Catholic Church contributed to the development of science comes from a biblical verse that was one of the most frequently quoted in the whole Middle Ages. And that verse is Wisdom 11:21. And that verse tells us that God has ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight. Okay, so that doesn't sound explosive right off the bat, but I promise you it is. God has ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight. What did people take that to mean? They took it to mean that the universe God has created is orderly. It makes sense. It's intelligible to our minds. It's mathematical. It's ordered according to patterns, measure, number, weight. There is something mathematical about the universe. St. Augustine, for example, said God is like a great geometer. He's a great practitioner of geometry. So for anybody watching who hated geometry, hated math, well, St. Augustine is implicitly rebuking you, because in fact mathematics is really a language that God uses in ordering and fashioning this universe that He's given us. So the Christian tradition, through this wisdom verse that was quoted all through the Middle Ages, dramatically amplifies an existing tradition in the West, going back to the 6th century BC, and the great pre-Socratic philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras. In the 6th century BC, Pythagoras had said, you know what the universe is made of? It's not made out of air or water or earth, as some of his contemporaries had said. It's made out of numbers. That's the fundamental constituent of our universe. Not physical stuff, but numbers, math. Math is everywhere. And this Christian tradition, building on Wisdom 11:21, took Pythagoras' obscure insight and in effect developed a whole civilization around it. That's pretty important. And in fact, even scientists who may not have given the matter a second thought lived in a civilization in which the orderliness of the world was taken for granted. So, for example, let's consider the gentleman who drew up for us the first periodic table of the elements, Dmitri Mendeleev. He so believed that the universe was orderly that when he began arranging the elements, and perhaps you've seen the periodic table of the elements, got all the constituent parts of our world, and they're listed according in rows, and then a series of rows creates columns, and he found that elements that were next to each other on the table possessed similar characteristics. Well, then he got to about element number 21, and there was a gap there. He couldn't find an element that should fit there. But he said, the relationships keep working if I skip number 21 and I keep going. But so convinced was he that something had to go there. So convinced was he that God couldn't have given us this universe, or that he couldn't believe we could live in a universe where there'd be a big gap on the periodic table. There had to be something that belonged there. So he predicted, well, someday we'll discover an element that goes there. I mean, what nerve the guy has to say, of course we'll find something to fit into the gap on my chart. But sure enough, what did they find? 10 years later, the element scandium was discovered. Where does it go? It's atomic number 21. So this is a key feature of our civilization. And in fact, the scientific method cannot be pursued unless you believe the universe is orderly. Because what do you do in the scientific method? What's it all about? The scientific method consists of gathering data about the world around you, and then studying that data, looking for patterns, trying to understand it, and then developing hypotheses about the data. Why do I think thus and so is occurring? And then devising experiments to then confirm or disconfirm my various hypotheses. Now, you cannot follow those steps unless you believe the universe is orderly. Because I have to be sure, I have to have a confidence that if I run the same experiment multiple times under the same conditions, I will get the same results. Now, if I live in a disorderly universe, I have no right to expect that. Maybe 6 times when I drop something, it will fall to the ground, but maybe the 7th time, the object will turn into Elvis. How do I know? If I don't live in an orderly universe, I have no right to expect that. And if I don't live in an orderly universe, I can't even begin to do science. I can't even begin to find patterns in the universe if I don't expect them to be there. This is essential for science. And in fact, Albert Einstein even said, it's a miracle that the universe is orderly. We have absolutely no right to assume that. And in fact, many civilizations did not assume it. They did not assume it. Ancient Babylon, for example, the Babylonians did not assume the universe was orderly. It was completely chaotic. Did science get started among the ancient Babylonians? The question answers itself, doesn't it? So these are essential points. These are essential points. That the universe is orderly and mathematical. Now, that does not mean that the universe is so orderly that God can't perform miracles, that would somehow violate the order of the universe. Of course, as Catholics, we believe in miracles. God can perform miracles. Of course we believe that. But understand what that means. You can only recognize a miracle if it takes place against a backdrop of order. If we lived in a completely chaotic universe, recognize a miracle if it takes place against a backdrop of order. If we lived in a completely chaotic universe, how could we recognize a miracle? Everything would be a miracle. Everything's crazy and chaotic and doesn't follow any laws. So we recognize God's miracles because He performs them within a universe of order. St. Anselm very helpfully clarified this point. He said that God has His absolute power, or potentia absoluta for you Latinists, and His ordered power, or potentia ordinata. That is to say, sure, God has the raw power to turn that object into Elvis, but He also has His ordered power by which He behaves according to the laws that He's built into the universe, that it would not befit the dignity of our God for Him to behave in such a whimsical way. He can't do that. He has to, in effect, behave in a way that is consistent with His promises to us. And in effect, the functioning of the universe is one of those promises. So we expect to find order in the universe, and that's why scientists go looking for it. But as I say, not all civilizations have been able to do this, have had this insight. We take this insight for granted. The universe makes sense, we can find mathematical relationships in it, but not every civilization could. And one civilization that could not is Islamic civilization. Now, there's much we can say about Islamic contributions to civilization and even the sciences. For example, in some of what we might call the applied sciences, like medicine and optics. Well, Muslims made great contributions in those areas. But in the more theoretical sciences, Islamic science, in effect, suffered what Father Stanley Yaki calls a stillbirth. It seemed like it was going somewhere, and then boom, gone. And then today, of course, Islamic civilization is largely a backwater, scientifically. Now, why is that? Why did Islam suffer such devastation in terms of the sciences? One reason involves this matter of the ability to view the universe as being orderly. Islamic civilization could not do that. Because if you were to say that the universe is ordered according to certain laws that must be observed, that would be an insult to Allah, who may behave as arbitrarily as He wants. What looks like a law to you may just be one of His habits that He can discontinue at any time. Well, we got a break now, but come on back for some more myth-busting about the Church and science. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Before the break, we discussed some forbidden truths about the church and science. We know what we're supposed to say. We're supposed to say the church has been nothing but an obstacle to the sciences. But that's not what professional historians of science are saying. And if you recall from our first episode, I mentioned that the most depressing job on earth would be to be a professor of medieval studies, trying to tell people that the Middle Ages weren't really so bad. Well, I think a good runner-up for most depressing job on earth would be to be a historian of science, trying to argue that, in fact, the church had, by and large, a positive influence on the sciences. Even your fellow scientists aren't going to believe you, much less the general public. But yet you have an enormous amount of evidence that you can amass. And book after book after book is being written today, and yet you still can't crack through to the general public. One of the reasons I ended up writing a book called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization was that I was afraid that all these wonderful studies that professors are doing that are vindicating the church aren't getting to the general public. People are still being taught the nonsense about the church as an opponent of science. So now we've got to go and study this stuff so we can better defend ourselves. But let me tell you something. Today, if you were taking a course on the history of science, and some universities have that as a separate discipline, if you were taking a course in that and you said, oh, religion and science have been nothing but enemies over the years, you would be considered to have written, in effect, a fourth-grade term paper. Like, no one would take that seriously anymore. So let's return to our discussion from before the break, when I was saying that the key insight that allows a breakthrough in science in the West is the Catholic view of God as being orderly, a view that is derived principally, though by no means exclusively, through that wisdom verse, 11:21, that God has ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight. And we saw that St. Augustine took that to mean that God was a great geometer, and other Christian thinkers elaborated on it as well. At the cathedral school at Chartres, for example, in France, there was a lot of elaboration on that critical wisdom verse. Now, cathedral school, first of all, what's that? Charlemagne, who was emperor of the West from about 768 to 814, had established that the various cathedrals should have schools set up, attached to them. And these cathedral schools, in some cases, developed into our earliest universities, although we'll discuss that in a future episode. But at the cathedral school at Chartres, those scholars seized upon Wisdom 11:21 and took it to mean that if we want to understand the universe, we must understand it quantitatively. That's a fancy way of saying that if we want to understand the universe, we have to understand it through math. Well, that is actually an extraordinarily modern idea. The cathedral school at Chartres was really at its peak perhaps in the 12th century, and yet it's got this fantastically modern idea that at least at some level, the universe can and should be understood mathematically if we want to understand its workings and predict how it will behave in the future. We have to understand it through math. And they interpreted Wisdom 11:21 to mean just that the universe is mathematical and we understand it that way. Because the cathedral school at Chartres spread this idea far and wide, that the universe is mathematical and should be understood through math, they are increasingly given credit as having helped to launch the scientific revolution centuries before it really began to take place in the 17th century. In addition to that, the scholars at Chartres took for granted that God was orderly and had built natural laws into the world, and that if we want to understand how the world works, we first use our natural reason. And only when our natural reason breaks down do we then say we are faced with a miracle, we're faced with something supernatural, and we refer this to God. But the Chartres scholars were convinced that God has given us our reason for a reason. That we're not cows, we're not aardvarks, we're not ants. We have the ability to think and to draw cause and effect conclusions and relationships. Why would God give us this faculty unless we were meant to use it? And we become true human beings only when we use the unique gift that human beings alone possess, which is reason. So, for example, one scholar at Chartres said, "It is through reason that we are men. For if we turned our backs on the amazing rational beauty of the universe we live in, we should indeed deserve to be driven therefrom, like a guest unappreciative of the house into which he has been received." Another scholar at Chartres said, "I take nothing away from God. He's the author of all things, evil excepted. But the nature with which he endowed his creatures accomplishes a whole scheme of operations, and these too turn to his glory, because it is he who created this very nature." In other words, God created us with a rational nature. So we give him glory when we have recourse to that rational nature. Now that is very much the opposite of what people are told, isn't it, about the Catholic Church? I think most people are under the belief that the Church teaches you that you shouldn't use your human reason, that human reason is in some way phony or something to be despised even. But to the contrary, here we have one of the most accomplished and important schools of the whole Middle Ages telling us that we should use our reason if we want to understand the way the universe works. Now, from that, I return to the point that Chartres emphasized the mathematical nature of the universe, and in doing so, they gave birth to a central modern idea, that if you want to understand physical relationships and how the physical universe operates, you have to explain it mathematically. You have mastered the universe only when you have unlocked its mysteries through the language of mathematics. When you have unlocked its mysteries through the language of mathematics. And that's why Sir Isaac Newton was so impressive to people in the 18th century, when with a single equation he was able to account for all the motion in the universe. That was an extraordinarily elegant explanation of a seemingly complicated problem. All the different kinds of motion could be reduced to one equation. And so in the sense in which we're speaking of, he understood the universe because he was able to take disparate phenomena that are all different kinds of motion, but yet account for them all with one simple, elegant mathematical equation. So he is simply bringing to fruition the mission that the Cathedral School of Chartres gave to the scholars and scientists of the West. Now, another problem that was solved in large part by the Cathedral School at Chartres goes all the way back to the ancient world, all the way back to the world of ancient Greece and Rome. Because as far back as that time, people had believed that the heavenly bodies that you see out there were in fact in some way divine. They must have some kind of divine attributes, or perhaps they even have souls in some way, or they were composed of imperishable matter that operated according to laws different from those of our terrestrial world here on Earth. This was taken for granted for many reasons. For instance, in the ancient world, it was taken for granted that a body at rest tends to stay at rest. But a body in motion can only be in motion if something is forcing it into motion. So in other words, the ancient world took for granted that the natural state of things is to be at rest. Motion needs to be accounted for. And yet they look out in the sky and they see the planets are moving, but there's no big hand pushing them. So what's making them move? They should be at rest. What's making them move? So they had to posit all kinds of theories that maybe they have souls and the souls impart motion to them, or they're divine and that accounts for their movement, or later it was proposed that angels might be pushing them. There were all kinds of theories to account for this. But it was taken for granted that there must be different rules governing motion in outer space and governing motion on Earth, because what's going on? Why do they keep on moving? They just couldn't figure it out. These things must be fundamentally different from the things on our Earth. Now, Isaac Newton later showed that, in fact, the same laws of motion were at work in the heavens and on Earth. That was a breakthrough. But it wasn't something that just came out of left field. Because who really began thinking this for the first time? It was Terry of Chartres, another scholar at the Cathedral School of Chartres, in the 12th century. What did Terry say? He said that, in effect, what you have in the universe and in outer space are things that are composed of the same kind of matter that we have here on Earth. Now, he couldn't quite account for why they orbited and why they seemed to move on their own. He hadn't anticipated Newton's laws of motion. But by saying that the stuff out there is in no fundamental way any different from the stuff down here, he has paved the way for a central conclusion of modern science. Now, Thomas Goldstein is a recent historian of the history of science. What does he have to say about the cathedral school at Chartres? He says, in a period of 15 to 20 years, around the middle of the 12th century, a handful of men were consciously striving to launch the evolution of Western science and undertook every major step that was needed to achieve that end. Goldstein even went so far as to say that someday Terry of Chartres will be viewed as one of the great founders of modern science. Now, can you believe that? There's a historian writing just in this generation. And not only does he credit the church with lending an important impetus to the development of science, but he even goes all the way back to the 12th century to identify somebody nobody's ever heard of and say he may be one of the great architects of modern science. This is becoming absolutely common among historians of science. Yes, Richard Dawkins is writing his books. Daniel Dennett keeps writing his books as scientific atheists. But as historians of science, you consistently get more and more favor shown toward the Catholic Church. Now the question is, how do we get this information to the general public? And as I say, it's not going to get out there unless Catholics start telling it themselves. But that's only the tip of the iceberg, because what we've discussed today is very theoretical. The idea that the universe is orderly, and so on and on, that it's built according to fixed physical laws. That's all very theoretical. But next time, we're going to get down to the nuts and bolts, because next time we're going to look at how many priests were scientific pioneers. It's not enough to say, oh, look at all these scientists who happen to be Catholic. Well, that could be just a coincidence. They just happen to be Catholic. But when you're talking about priests who occupy such an elevated role in the life of the church, who have taken holy orders and have that sacred vocation, if they are great practitioners of the sciences and are congratulated by the popes for doing so, then surely the Catholic Church cannot be the enemy of science. So let's look at these great scientific heroes in the Catholic Church next time when we come back once again for the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. Last week, we started to overturn that firmly established myth that the Church has been an enemy of science. Today, we're going to bury that myth once and for all. So join me for the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Dr. Thomas Woods. Last time, we engaged in some myth-busting. We looked at things everybody knows. The Church is an enemy of science, right? Everybody knows that. We're all taught that in school. What we started to see was that modern professors who actually do this for a living are starting to say something like the opposite. They're starting to say, we need to be fair to the Catholic Church and give her her due in the development of science in the Western world. And some have gone so far as to ask the truly forbidden question, is the development of science in Western civilization something that may have occurred because of the Catholic Church rather than in spite of it, as we're so often told? Last time we placed particular emphasis on a central teaching that modern science takes for granted, namely that the world we live in makes sense, You can understand it. You can expect to find patterns in it if you investigate it. You can expect to find mathematical relationships if you investigate it. In fact, you can hope to reduce the phenomena of nature to some kind of mathematical formula so as to understand it better and predict it better. Well, where did this crazy idea come from? It came right out of the Bible with Wisdom 11:21 that tells us that God has ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight. And we saw that the early church fathers, the cathedral school at Chartres, and others besides took this to mean the universe makes sense, so let's go find out about it. Let's go study it. Let's go use the scientific method, gather data, formulate hypotheses, and then test those hypotheses. You can't do any of these things unless you already believe the universe makes sense and is orderly and follows consistent laws. And that idea comes from the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church insists that God is a God of order, and He's a God who has built patterns into our universe that we can discover using our minds. Science is impossible without this fundamental insight, and I gave examples last time of civilizations who, lacking that insight, also lacked science. This time, we're going to talk a little bit more about specifics. We're going to name names today. We're going to look at specific people who were Catholics who pioneered in the sciences. And specifically, we're even going to look at people who invented things and who made discoveries that we take for granted today, but that are typically forgotten or left out of the standard textbook treatment. So, for instance, I don't think it's particularly well known that 35 craters on the moon are named after Jesuit scientists and mathematicians. I also don't think it's particularly well known that when you look at the history of mathematics, a great many of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived were Jesuits. People don't realize that. Is that taught in school? Not usually. But it's very interesting that in the early 19th century, when an early historian of mathematics set about chronicling the 300 or so greatest mathematicians of the previous 27 centuries, so going back to 900 BC, and then going to his day about 1800 AD, those 27 centuries, he found that of the 300, about 5% were Jesuits. Now, consider how significant that is. The Jesuits were around for only little over two of those 27 centuries. Because the Jesuits, remember, were founded in 1540, and then they were suppressed briefly in the 1770s, so a little over 2 centuries, and yet still, in an impartial compilation of the greatest mathematicians of all time, it turns out that 1 out of every 20 belongs to this single order of Catholic priests. Well, again, rather significant, is it not? But we'll leave even the Jesuit accomplishments to the side now. Let's mention Roger Bacon, a great 13th century figure. Roger Bacon was a Franciscan who taught at Oxford and who's been considered a forerunner of the scientific revolution. Roger Bacon emphasized the importance of experimentation and observation. These are the key aspects of modern science, that we don't simply rely on what other people have said. Well, Aristotle was really smart, so we'll just sort of more or less go with him. We have to verify scientific conclusions on the basis of either our own observations or on the basis of experiments by people who are carrying them out according to the sound principles of scientific method. Now, Roger Bacon consistently emphasized this, and he said, without experiment, nothing can be adequately known. An argument proves theoretically, but does not give the certitude necessary to remove all doubt. Nor will the mind repose in the clear view of truth unless it finds it by way of experiment. Well, there is a scientific turn of mind right there with Roger Bacon in the 13th century at Oxford. Among other things, Roger Bacon identified the following as obstacles to the transmission of truth: uninstructed popular opinion and long-standing but erroneous custom. Well, all of these, both of these things, I think, the church is usually accused of encouraging. Well, you're just going along with what people say, or you're trying to form what they think. You're trying to get them to believe crazy superstition. But in fact, to the contrary, Roger Bacon is saying these are the things we have to try to avoid. We have to use experimentation and our own observation, because maybe what people believe is untrue. We need to verify things using experiment. Or St. Albert the Great, who taught at the University of Paris. One of his students was St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Albert, according to the Dictionary of Scientific Biography, was proficient in all branches of science. He was one of the most famous precursors of modern science in the High Middle Ages. That's why in 1941, Pope Pius XII named him the patron of all who cultivate the natural sciences. And well, he should. In fact, he was so prolific, his output spanned so many disciplines, that even people who despise the Church continue to admire Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus. The aim of natural science, he said, was not simply to accept the statements of others, that is, what is narrated by people, but to investigate the causes that are at work in nature for ourselves. Well, there you go. Now, let's get down to some brass tacks here, though. Let's move further toward the present and consider some long-forgotten names. For example, Father Nicholas Steno was in fact considered to be the father of stratigraphy, which is in fact the study of the layers of the Earth's surface. And geologists need to know Steno's principles. He later became a Catholic priest. In the late 1980s, he was beatified by Pope John Paul II, who praised him for his sanctity and his science. I'd like to focus specifically, though, on the Jesuits, because they, I think, have been criticized like no other religious group in the Catholic world over the centuries. They've been thrown out of countries, they've been banned, they've been suppressed, they've been imprisoned, they've been killed. It's unbelievable, the calumny against the Jesuits. And yet, and here I'm quoting an expert on the Jesuits who has no axe to grind in this one way or the other, the Jesuits by the 18th century had contributed to the development of pendulum clocks, pantographs, barometers, reflecting telescopes and microscopes, to scientific fields as various as magnetism, optics, and electricity. They observed, in some cases before anyone else, the colored bands on Jupiter's surface, the Andromeda Nebula, and Saturn's rings. They theorized about the circulation of the blood independently of Harvey, the theoretical possibility of flight, the way the moon affected the tides, and the wave-like nature of light. Star maps of the southern hemisphere, symbolic logic, flood control measures, introducing plus and minus signs into Italian mathematics, all were typical Jesuit achievements. Now, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but how often are students taught this in school? Never. It's not like they're taught it a little, or once in a while they hear about this. They never hear it. They never hear it. I've never seen a Western civilization textbook that takes note of this phenomenon. Not one. And believe me, over many an anguished night when I was a professor in New York, I would search through Western Civ textbooks, one after the other. Which one of these can I assign in good conscience? And it was hard to find any. So what I wound up having to do, in case you're wondering, is assign a not-so-good textbook, but then also assign my own How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. And I took some comfort in knowing that, okay, maybe the students won't read my book, but these are the same students who won't read the textbook either. And so one encouraging thing about the fact that we live in a world in which students don't read is that they won't be reading the propaganda either. And so it'll be easier for me to de-brainwash them, because they won't be reading anything. They won't be reading anything to contradict that. They'll actually finally get to hear the truth for a change, unmediated. But consider now some more specific examples of Jesuits and their achievements. We have only a minute before we have the break, but let's consider Father Giambattista Riccioli was the first person to calculate how fast a freely falling body accelerates to the ground. Surprising, isn't it? Father Francesco Grimaldi first discovered and named the phenomenon of the diffraction of light. Now, Father Francesco Grimaldi, you may be thinking about pasta sauce, but that's Francesco Rinaldi, and I'm sure Francesco Grimaldi would be appalled at that sauce. But what's interesting about the two of them is that they worked together to produce a selenograph, which is a detailed description, or a detailed map, in effect, of the surface of the moon, depicting all the various aspects of it. And their selenograph adorns the entrance to this day to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. These were not stupid idiots. Now, there are still other scientists we have to cover, and we'll be getting to them a little bit after the break. But for now, let's just note that it isn't just that we've got a bunch of scattered scientists here and there. It's that in practically every scientific discipline, there are priests who are involved, not just Catholic laymen, but priests who occupy this most important vocation in the Church. So join me in a minute. Let's keep doing some myth busting. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. We've been looking today at unknown and forgotten Catholic scientists who were not simply Catholics, but who were Catholic priests. So I think this helps to overturn the idea that there is some necessary contradiction between being a Catholic and being a scientist, between the Catholic faith and scientific endeavor. Now, any one of the people that I've mentioned up to now, and whom I will mention in a moment, would make the subject of an excellent term paper or book. And yet, astonishingly little is written about these great Jesuit scientists. In fact, can you believe there is nothing in the English language, there is no systematic study in the English language of the Jesuit scientists? There's no book on the subject. So graduate students out there, here's your project. Okay, you get your job somewhere. We need you to start working on this, because this is a lost and forgotten chapter in the history of Western civilization, and it doesn't deserve to be. These men deserve better, and the Catholic Church deserves better, because we would go a long way toward overturning a lot of this mythology if people simply knew some of this information. But unfortunately, they don't. You have to be some kind of a code breaker to figure it out, to find it in the midst of all the nonsense out there in the world. And there are books on every bizarre subject under the sun, hundreds of them on everything, nothing on the Jesuit scientists, and yet it would be a work of many volumes to write this stuff. But it needs to be done. Somebody should do it. I don't want to do it. It would take too long, and I don't have time, but I want somebody to do it. It's an important project. Let's consider another Jesuit in the modern period, Father Athanasius Kircher. My confirmation name is Athanasius, so I have a certain kinship to Father Kircher. Among other things, he's considered to be the father of Egyptology. Maybe a new word, but it simply means the study of ancient Egypt. And Father Kircher is known as the father of Egyptology because of his great scholarly work, and he did that work even before we discovered the so-called Rosetta Stone, which helped us to decode and decipher the various hieroglyphic symbols. In fact, it was because of Father Kircher's work that when we did find the Rosetta Stone, scholars knew what to look for and knew how to approach the subject. He's been called the master of 100 arts, and a historian writing as recently as 2003 said that Father Kircher is one of the few people of whom it can be justly said that all knowledge was his domain. Astonishing, we've never heard of this guy. His work in chemistry helped to debunk alchemy, which was this sort of phony science that alleged that you could take base metals and somehow transmute them into gold. There were serious scientists, even Isaac Newton and Boyle, who took this seriously. And it was Father Athanasius Kircher who helped to throw cold water on it. Again, forgotten, down the Orwellian memory hole. Roger Boscovich was a Catholic priest who is known to many as the father of atomic theory. In fact, Werner Heisenberg, in the 20th century, of Heisenberg uncertainty principle fame for all you scientists out there, gave a paper in which he praised and honored Father Boscovich. And a great many other scientists have also pointed to him in the 18th century as being the father of atomic theory. He's been called the greatest genius Yugoslavia ever produced, and yet forgotten. Let's consider the study of earthquakes, seismology. The Jesuits were particularly well placed to study seismology because they had universities all over the United States and, of course, indeed around the world. So they could build up seismographic equipment at these various universities and collect data about earthquakes and then bring it all together and systematize it and examine it from a central location. So they began in the early 20th century building seismological stations at their universities across the United States. Now, let's also consider, by the way, that it was a Jesuit who wrote the very first book on seismology in the United States. The first textbook on seismology in the United States was written in 1936 by Father J.B. McIlwain. Father McIlwain, by the way, has a medal named after him. Every year, the American Geophysical Union awards a medal to an aspiring young geophysicist. And that medal is named after Father McIlwain, the great Jesuit who wrote the first such textbook in America and who also served as the president of the American Geophysical Union. For these reasons, the study of earthquakes, or seismology, has become known as the Jesuit science. Now, do people know about this? No, but should they? The question answers itself. What else did the Jesuits do, though? Sure, they were studying about earthquakes and measuring freely falling bodies and studying ancient Egypt and studying chemistry. So what have you done for us lately? Well, it so happens that from the beginning, at least from the 18th century all the way up to the present, Jesuit scientists have traveled around the world, bringing knowledge of Western science everywhere they went, to places as far off as China and India. They built up, in effect, the scientific infrastructure of a great many countries around the world, ranging all the way from Ecuador to the Philippines and beyond. Throughout South America, for example, they set up meteorological and seismological stations all over the place, which were particularly helpful in, obviously, in predicting the weather and keeping an eye on various kinds of natural disasters. People have the Jesuits to thank for that. Now, here's a part of the history of science that's been totally forgotten. I realize the whole episode is stuff that's been totally forgotten, but this has been forgotten squared, which is the history of modern cathedrals and basilicas in Western Europe. It turns out that a good number of these cathedrals and basilicas were actually built to function not only as cathedrals and basilicas, but also to function as solar observatories. It turns out that from the 17th and 18th centuries onward, there was no better mechanism anywhere in the world, nothing more precise, better mechanism anywhere in the world, nothing more precise than these cathedrals and basilicas for measuring the perceived motion of the sun. And they were constructed so that you could observe the sun's apparent movement on the floor using various shadows and the like. Well, this is extremely significant because, in fact, modern astronomers were able to use these precise instruments in order to verify important theories about planetary orbits. For example, it was a Catholic astronomer named Giovanni Cassini who used the Cathedral of San Petronio in Bologna, in the heart of the Papal States, where the Pope lives, the Pope who's supposedly discouraging the sciences. It was in that basilica that this Catholic astronomer Cassini used the mechanism of this basilica to in fact verify Johannes Kepler's theories of planetary motion. That was done in the Papal States in a Catholic basilica by a Catholic astronomer. And Kepler himself, by the way, who was not a Catholic, nevertheless consistently observed that his favorite scientific correspondents were Jesuits, were Catholic priests, because they were so knowledgeable. They understood what he was talking about, unlike most of the world. Again, these are forgotten chapters, but they don't need to be. And they're starting to be brought out little by little. Isn't it interesting that it was a professor at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley is not exactly known as being a big cheerleading institution for the Catholic Church. We'll put it that way. But Professor Heilbronn there wrote a book, about 5-6 years ago, called The Sun in the Church. And he told the story, this forgotten story, about the use of cathedrals and basilicas in the advancement of our knowledge of astronomy. In fact, Heilbronn went and said that there is no institution anywhere on earth that had done more for the advancement of astronomy or contributed more resources to this study than the Catholic Church. Now, in large part, the Catholic Church did that because we wanted to be able to predict equinoxes, for instance, so that we could establish when Easter should be celebrated and establish it far enough in advance that we could enjoy a 40-day period of penance in advance, namely Lent. But nevertheless, once they're built, scientists begin to use them, Catholic scientists, and advances science. A totally forgotten chapter, finally being brought forth by a figure, as far as I know, isn't Catholic at all, but just is interested to recover important work and discoveries that, for one reason or another, we've forgotten about. Now, the objection in the back of people's minds, and it's an understandable one at this point, is, what about Galileo? Because you can talk all you want about all the wonderful things the Church did for science in general, and astronomy in particular, but what about Galileo? I mean, wasn't he tortured, and didn't they try to kill him or something because he disagreed with the Church? But that is part of a mythology that, let's say, is extremely difficult to dislodge from people's minds. Now, I think it is safe to say that the Galileo episode is not exactly the Church's shining moment, and it should be acknowledged that there is reason for regret about it, to say the least. In fact, in my 7 years as a university professor in New York, I would say that the one episode that did more than everything else put together to discredit the Catholic Church in the minds of my students was the perceived history of the Galileo episode. There's no question about it. So the consequences of it were just disastrous. At the same time, I think it is important to revisit this episode for two reasons. First, because so that it won't seem as if we're just trying to duck it, or that I'm just trying to find the good news and not dwell on the not so good. But secondly, because I think the standard telling of the Galileo story is incomplete, or is unfair, or is one-sided. Yes, it's, as I say, it's nothing to be particularly proud of, but at the same time, there are facts, I think, that deserve mention. And before getting into the details of Galileo, we'll just simply say this. Galileo was a genius and had much of importance to say, but his central thesis, that in fact the Earth orbits the Sun rather than the other way around, could not be established in his day to the satisfaction of all thinking people. I think the assumption is that if you thought that the Sun went around the Earth in the 1600s, you must be some kind of a dolt. You know, you need to be smacked in the face or something. What's the matter with you? Don't you study science? But in fact, those who believe that the Sun went around the Earth in the 17th century, in some ways, still had the better of the argument. They had important arguments to advance against Galileo that he himself could not answer. In fact, if you raised them to Galileo, he'd pretty much have to say, hey, look over there, and then run away, because he's got no answer for them. So next time, we're going to take our time and go through this Galileo case step by step, see what really did happen to him, what didn't happen to him, and we'll look at the arguments that were used. And I'm going to give a detailed explanation of the arguments that people who disagreed with Galileo made, to show you they weren't stupid, they weren't just ignorant religious people. They were making arguments that had gone unanswered since the days of Aristotle. And they were explaining that if you're going to say that our interpretation of the Bible up to now, which some people thought said that the Sun was going around the Earth, you're going to tell us that's wrong, the science better be absolutely ironclad, true, and proved for sure. But it wasn't, and Galileo did not get the better of the argument. So that's where we're going to pick up next time. Let's look at Galileo and see what really happened next time on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Thanks. The Galileo case. Does it really prove that the Church was an enemy of science? What really happened in the Galileo incident? Let's look at it today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're taking on the difficult question of Galileo, because for the past couple of episodes I've been trying to explain that modern scholars reject the old idea that the Catholic Church was nothing but an opponent of the sciences. In fact, you would be considered almost beyond help if you continued to argue that to a professional historian of science. Nobody takes that seriously anymore, believe it or not. They really don't. However, the Galileo case still occupies such a prominent place in the popular mind that it's, I think, perhaps the greatest obstacle in our paths to trying to persuade people that, in fact, the Church has not consistently been an opponent of the sciences or any such thing. So I think it's important to go into this Galileo case in a little more detail than we usually get. And I will say up front, as I said last time, that I'm not here to suggest that every course of action pursued by important churchmen, and even in this case a pope, was wise or prudent. In fact, I think it has damaged the Church's reputation tremendously. At the same time, though, in all fairness, I think it's only fair that both sides receive a fair hearing. And typically that's not what happens. What happens is Galileo is portrayed as the great hero who is irrationally put upon by ignoramuses from the Catholic Church. Well, it's time to at least hear both sides. Now, John Henry Cardinal Newman was the great 19th century convert from Anglicanism. A great many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Cardinal Newman. And he was a great historian in his own right. And he used to say that the Galileo case was, quote, the one stock argument against the Church with regard to the Church's relationship to science. Because he said, in effect, that this is the only argument people typically have. And that if you say to them, what if for the sake of argument I granted you the Galileo case? Do you have anything else? What else have you got? Again, most of the time people will just kind of stand there, stare at you blankly, or run away, because that is all they have. So even if you were to grant the Galileo case, Cardinal Newman says this is the one stock argument that's always brought out. But people unjustly extrapolate from this one incident and then draw general conclusions about the Church and science. It's unjust. Well, what we're going to start with is a gentleman who lived before Galileo, who was a 16th century figure. Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus, was a Polish astronomer. Copernicus believed in general in what we would call the Ptolemaic system, or system of the universe or of our solar system. He had one change that he wanted to make, but let's first look at what did Ptolemy believe. Ptolemy was an ancient astronomer. He was a Greek, and Ptolemy proposed that the way the planets were arranged was as follows, that you had the Earth at the center, and you had the Sun and the other planets orbiting the Earth. And according to the Ptolemaic system, or sometimes called the Ptolemaic Aristotelian system, the planets orbited the Earth in perfect circles, and they orbited the Earth at a perfectly constant speed. It was also suggested in this model that the various heavenly bodies, including the other planets and the moon, were perfect spheres. Now, Copernicus took all this, just about all this, as we'll see, for granted. What he suggested, however, was that what we should do is switch a couple of these things. We should put the Sun at the center and have the Earth simply be one of the planets orbiting the Sun. But he kept everything else. He kept the perfect spheres. He kept the perfectly circular orbits and the constant speed. He kept all that. He simply said, let's put the Sun at the center. This became known as the so-called heliocentric system. The system that put the Earth at the center is known as the geocentric system. Now, this is not a ridiculous system, by the way, the pre-Copernican one. The idea that the Earth is at the center and everything's orbiting it, let's just say, first of all, that that's not a ridiculous conclusion. It does seem to comport with common sense. We don't feel like we're moving. right? People standing on Earth, we don't feel like we're moving. And in fact, we speak of the sun rising and the sun setting. We speak in this way. So it's not a ridiculous position. And as I'll show later on in our episode today, there were actually some excellent scientific arguments in favor of the idea that in fact the Earth was motionless and it was the sun that was orbiting the Earth. So we'll put that to one side. And we'll also note that this system actually worked very well for observing planetary motion. It actually worked pretty well. It wouldn't have lasted for 2,000 years or 1,500 years anyway if it didn't sort of work. It does sort of work. Now, the system that Ptolemy proposed wound up getting a little more complicated over the years in order to make his system correspond to what was being seen in the sky. So it is true, he had to add things called deferents and epicycles, but roughly this was his system. The Earth at the center, the planets going in constant speeds and circular orbits, and with perfect spheres. So this is the system that Copernicus is going to overturn slightly. Copernicus puts the sun at the center. Now, Copernicus died in 1543, and he, in fact, as he was practically on his deathbed, he got to see, he had just published his work at the urging, in fact, of cardinals. Catholic cardinals urged him to publish his work, and he dedicated his famous book to Pope Paul III when it was published in 1543. He was afraid primarily of ridicule not by theologians, but by astronomers, who had very good arguments against the idea that the Earth was in motion. As I say, we'll get to those later. But the Copernican system shared much in common with Ptolemy. It just switched the Earth and the sun, but it was subject to no formal Catholic censure until the Galileo case in the next century. His system, his so-called heliocentric system, was taught as a legitimate theory at Jesuit universities throughout the 16th century. Nobody got in trouble for this, and so on and so forth. It was just fine. It was treated as a theory. Now, in the 17th century, early 17th century, Galileo comes along. Now, Galileo was responsible for discoveries in physics and other areas, but we're focusing on what he saw in his telescope. Because although he didn't invent the telescope, he put it to important use. Because when Galileo looked in that telescope, he was able to see things that undermined aspects of Ptolemy's system. For instance, Galileo noted that clearly there are craters in the moon. I mean, the moon is not a perfect sphere, so that spherical thing is wrong. He noted that there were moons orbiting Jupiter. This contradicts Ptolemy because here we have something orbiting something other than the Earth. These moons are orbiting Jupiter. But more than that, as Jupiter is moving in its orbit, its moons are staying with it. One of the arguments against the idea that the Earth could be moving was that if the Earth moved, it would leave the moon behind. But here's Jupiter moving, and its moons are orbiting with it. And he observed other things through his telescope as well. These things could not be reconciled with the model of Ptolemy, in which everything orbits the Earth, and so on and so forth. Now, Galileo and his work were in fact welcomed and celebrated by prominent churchmen. For instance, in late 1610, Father Christopher Clavius wrote to tell Galileo that his fellow Jesuit astronomers had confirmed the discoveries that Galileo had made through his telescope. Galileo was greeted with enthusiasm in Rome in 1611. There was a day of lectures given in his honor. He wrote, "I have been received and shown favor by many illustrious cardinals, prelates, and princes of this city." He enjoyed a long audience with Pope Paul V and enjoyed a day of activities in his honor at the Jesuits' Roman College. In 1612, for the first time in print, Galileo said that he favored the Copernican system, at least the part about the sun being in the center. He believed in the heliocentric system. Well, this did not get him in trouble. In fact, in this particular writing, one of the many enthusiastic letters of congratulation he got came from the future Pope Urban VIII, who in fact was the Pope who, as we'll see, later got Galileo in some trouble. But in 1612, there was no trouble at all with what Galileo said, and yet it's the same thing. So what's going on here? Well, again, the Church is arguing that the Copernican model is okay as a theoretical model, but it hasn't yet been proven to be the literal truth. The literal truth. He believed that the sun really was in the center. It wasn't just an elegant model. The sun really belonged in the center. That really was it. The Earth really was moving. But as I say, he couldn't really prove this. The evidence that Galileo had that the Earth was in motion consisted, for example, of arguing from the evidence from the tides. Of course, we know the waves at the ocean. He argued that the reason that we see waves at the ocean is that the Earth is both rotating and it's revolving. So it rotates and it goes around the sun, and the result of all this is it's shaking up the water and creating the waves in the ocean. Well, if that sounds like a silly explanation, that's because it is. So people didn't necessarily buy that. But meanwhile, Galileo was walking around claiming that all biblical verses that make it sound as if the Earth is motionless need to be reinterpreted. This was the problem. Can a layman just run around demanding the reinterpretation of biblical verses on the basis of a scientific theory that he can't even prove? And this was at a time, remember, when the Protestant Reformation was not exactly yet a distant memory. And Protestants were always hounding the Catholic Church for not giving the Bible its due and not listening to the Bible enough. So here's Galileo going around saying the Bible's got to be reinterpreted. So let's come back and try and make sense of what ended up happening to Galileo and who was right and who was wrong. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. We're talking about Galileo, and before the break we noted that Galileo believed very passionately in the Copernican model, by which he meant that the sun was at the center of our solar system, so to speak, and that the Earth was one of the planets that orbited it. But as I also suggest, that he did not have ironclad proof of that by any means. And if you talk to any historian of science who knows anything about the 17th century, he will tell you that the geocentrists, those who disagreed with Galileo and put the Earth at the center, still had a very good and reasonable scientific argument. And I want to amplify that point and just show that it wasn't a question of complete morons irrationally opposing Galileo, and Galileo being a wonderful genius who has to tolerate all these stupid ignoramuses. To the contrary, they had extremely good arguments that he could not answer. The main argument involved something called stellar parallax. Now that sounds very complicated, but you'll be amazed at how simple it is. Let's first just look at that word parallax. This is a phenomenon that we're all familiar with. We see it every day. Parallax shift works as follows. Let's suppose, for lack of a better prop, that this candle is my mother, and I'm on a merry-go-round as a child, and I'm looking at my mother watch me go around the merry-go-round. And let's suppose that over in the distance there's a tree over here. But let's say that over here there's a hot dog stand. So here I am, I'm going on the merry-go-round, and I'm looking at Mom, and I'm waving, and when I get to this part of the merry-go-round and I look at her, I see her against the tree. But when I get to this part and I look at her from this angle, I see her against the merry-go-round. Well, I don't say to my mother, hey, how come you're shifting around while I'm on the merry-go-round? I just know that in each case it's because I'm looking at her from a different angle. When I look at her from this angle, I see her against the tree. When I look at her from this angle, I see her against the hot dog stand. This is called a parallax shift. It's why if you look at a close-up object against a background, and you look at it with one eye, and then you look at it with the other eye, it seems to shift against the background. It's not because the object is actually moving, it's that you're looking at that object from a slightly different angle when you look at it from either of your eyes. Now, stellar parallax simply means a parallax shift that involves stars. And here, I'm going to refer you now to this diagram. What we see here in the diagram, you'll see on the left-hand side there are two human eyes. A little disturbing, but just work with me here. Look at the top eye in the upper left-hand corner. When that eye is looking at the object in the middle is that yellow star. From that angle, it sees the yellow star against the blue background at the lower right of the diagram. Now let's look at the bottom eye in the lower left corner, we see the bottom human eye. When it looks up at the object, it sees it against the red background. So the apparent shifting of that object is the parallax shift. Now let's look at our second diagram. This one is portraying outer space. And here, instead of two human eyes, we have two solid circles. The top solid circle is the Earth on, let's say, January 1st. The bottom one is 6 months later, when the Earth has gone halfway around the Sun. Now, what's going on here? Well, notice that, again, we have a closer-up object and some farther away objects. In the case of my merry-go-round example, my mother was the close-up object, and the tree and the hot dog stand were farther away. Here, we have a closer-up star, and then we have stars that are farther away. Now, on January 1st, when we look at that close-up star, we see it against the background of other stars more in the distance. Now, 6 months later, when we look back at that star, we're looking at it from another angle, so we're going to see it against a different background of stars. In other words, in the same way that my mother seems to shift, depending on where I am on the merry-go-round, close-up stars are going to seem to shift depending on where we are on the Earth's orbit around the Sun. So we should see a parallax shift. We should see the closer-up stars appearing to move against the background of the farther-away stars. Okay, that's the end of the diagram segment today. Well, what does this all boil down to? It boils down to this, that in fact, at that time in the 17th century, geocentrists were making that argument. They were saying, okay, Galileo, if you're so sure the Earth is going around the Sun, how come we don't see parallax shifts? Now, that's not a stupid argument, is it? Does that sound like a dumb guy argument? That's a very sophisticated argument, isn't it? But Galileo had no answer for that. And again, the Church's attitude was, if you can't prove to us that this is absolutely true, then the best we can do for you is say you can use it as a theory, but you certainly can't go around saying, well, the whole Bible needs to be revisited and reinterpreted. You can't do that till you prove it. And as I say, it had not been proven. The stellar parallax question had not been dealt with. And in fact, it wasn't until a very long time afterward that we got sensitive enough equipment to be able to detect the parallax shift. It is there, but the distances involved, with the stars being so far away from us, were so much greater than anyone thought. No one had any idea they'd be so far away. No one realized that the parallax shift would be so tiny because of the distances involved. It looked as if there were no parallax shift, and so therefore the Earth is motionless. So I think that's important, just as a matter of justice, to point out that these were not just stupid heads. That's a serious objection to Galileo. Now, Galileo refuses the compromise that's offered to him, whereby you can teach this as a theory, but at this point, it has not been proven. And again, the Church, as I said, is sensitive to Protestant charges that Catholics aren't paying proper regard to the Bible, so you have all these factors at work. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine said, look, if there were a real proof that the Sun is in the center of the universe, that the Earth is in the third heaven, and that the Sun does not go round the Earth, but the Earth round the Sun, then we should have to proceed with great circumspection in explaining passages of Scripture which appear to teach the contrary, and rather admit that we did not understand them than declare an opinion to be false which is proved to be true. But he said, as for myself, I shall not believe that there are such proofs until they are shown to me. Well, that's not a crazy position to hold, it seems to me. In 1624, Galileo was again received with great enthusiasm in Rome. The Pope told him that the Church had never declared Copernicanism to be a heresy and would never do so. And the Pope decided to hang on to this idea that Galileo could continue to teach what he wanted to teach as long as it was in the realm of theory, until such time, if ever, it should become established firmly as fact. Well, Galileo broke the rules. In 1632, he wrote his Dialogue on the Great World Systems. And in this work, he does not, in fact, stick to the idea that the Sun being at the center is a mere theory. He suggests that it's a fact. But worse than that was that Galileo wrote this dialogue as a dialogue. And one of the characters in this dialogue was a dunce, a dummy. And into the dummy's mouth he put the Pope's opinions. well, you're not exactly going to ingratiate yourself into the Pope's favor by taking his view and putting it in the mouth of the idiot. But this was sort of typical of Galileo, who had a very, very, well, some might say aggressive kind of way about him. He had a very irascible nature. He had a personality that left a bit to be desired sometimes. So, for instance, if you disagreed with Galileo on something like the nature of sunspots, he would come out and publicly call you a blockhead. But this was not a subtle person. And there's no subtlety at work when you take the Pope's opinion and you put it in the words of the fool in your dialogue. Well, Father Greenberger, who was a Jesuit, who was a big fan of Galileo, had said that if he had just kept to the idea that this is a theory and had not tried to make it stick as absolute fact before it could be proven, there would never have been an issue. But what seems to have happened here, the way I read it, is that you've got several factors coming together simultaneously to bring about this unfortunate outcome in the Galileo case. You have the fact that Galileo can't actually prove this, and that there is a very good argument against it, the parallax shift argument. He can't answer that. You have the fact that Protestants are putting pressure on Catholics, saying you've got to stick to the Bible, you can't just indiscriminately go and adopt novel interpretations unless you've got really good reason. And then you have this clash of personalities between Galileo and the Pope. And that's a big problem as well. It's the way human nature is. Because as we've seen, this Pope, Urban VIII, had previously praised Galileo, had had no problem with Galileo publishing the Copernican theory, and even assured him that the Church would never condemn this theory. So it can't just be that the Church refuses to allow evidence or refuses to allow science. This was all allowed. The Galileo tragedy occurred because of the convergence of all these factors. Now, that doesn't excuse what happened. Galileo was, in 1633, told that he could not publish in this area at all. Does not excuse that. But on the other hand, it helps us to understand it a little bit better, and that's important too. Now, a good many scholars have begun to argue that people at the time, at least some of them, understood that the sentence against Galileo was intended in large part personally against him. Because, for example, Father Boscovich, whom we talked about last time, the father of atomic theory, openly used the idea of a moving earth in his work, and he never got in trouble, was never hauled before any church tribunal. So, as I say, a great many people have said that it was aimed personally at Galileo. Now, having said all this, as I say, my purpose here is not to say that there was no wrong done or that this episode is something to celebrate. But at the same time, I think we can understand that what actually happened here was the fruit not of any mythical Catholic hostility to science, but merely the unfortunate convergence of a variety of factors occurring at the same time. Because what we've seen in these past few episodes is that the Church's achievements when it comes to science are legion and are substantial. And that we have seen that more and more professionals who actually do this for a living, who study the history of science for a living, are saying that Galileo case or no Galileo case, the Church helped to make the scientific revolution possible. And it helped make it possible not simply because a great many Catholic priests engaged in important scientific discoveries, or wrote important scientific works, or composed great scientific encyclopedias, all of which the Jesuits did. It's not simply that. It's that the Church provided the framework in which science was possible. It made us believe that the universe could be understood by our minds and encouraged us to engage in this type of undertaking. And finally, even beyond that, the Church encouraged, yes, believe it or not, the free interchange of ideas. It encouraged a culture of debate and discussion. That was the culture that was fostered in the university system of the Middle Ages. And that's what we're going to look at next time. In the universities, we see the Western tradition of rigorous, rational debate back and forth to discover the truth taking root. And who was the great patron of that university system? The Catholic Church. So, I look forward once again to being with you and talking once again about another unfortunately unheralded aspect of our Western civilization, the Church's fostering of the university system, which gives us our great civilization. Thank you. The church is the enemy of knowledge and learning, her opponents say. Well, then why did she give birth to the university system? It's another forbidden question. We're going to look at it today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. This week we're going to be talking about the development of the university system and the spread of learning throughout Western Europe, which are developments that are typically thought to have taken place rather in spite of the Catholic Church instead of because of it. But as usual, we're here to overturn the conventional wisdom. Now, for a long time, it was said that a dark age descended upon Europe with the rise of the Catholic Church to prominence following the decline of the Roman Empire. That for 1,000 years there was nothing but backwardness and darkness in the West. We've perhaps all heard this. But today, more and more we see historians are scaling back the time period that they would designate as dark. No one in his right mind refers to the 1,000 years from the late 400s to the 1400s as dark. Only a lunatic would call, for example, the 13th century dark. In fact, there was a great book written once called The 13th Greatest of Centuries. Now, it is true. There was a dark period after the fall of Rome. There was a time where education declined, culture declined, civilization declined. But was that the fault of the Catholic Church, with barbarian groups in control politically of various parts of Europe? Was that the Church's fault? Now, it's interesting to note what historian Will Durant said. Now, who is Will Durant? Why do we care what he said? The interesting thing about Will Durant is not only that he wrote a zillion books, he was the Stephen King of history, seemed to be writing, sitting at his typewriter 24 hours a day. What's significant about Durant is that he was an agnostic. He had no dog in this particular hunt. He was not out to defend the Catholic Church, and sometimes he could be kind of vicious toward the Church. But even Will Durant understands that it's not fair to blame everything that goes wrong in Western Europe on the Catholic Church. Durant said, the basic cause of cultural retrogression was not Christianity, but barbarism, not religion, but war. The human inundations ruined or impoverished cities, monasteries, libraries, schools, and made impossible the life of the scholar or the scientist. And then he says, perhaps the destruction would have been worse had not the Church maintained some measure of order in a crumbling civilization. Well, even in the midst of the crumbling, the Church did everything she could. And on another episode, we will look at the role of the monks. The monks did so many things, we should have 100 episodes on them. We'll have one. But that's for another time. For now, let's note that in the 8th century and the 9th century, Catholics are going out of their way, Catholic bishops, to build schools. Charlemagne, the great emperor of the West, ordered the various cathedrals to open schools, as I mentioned in a previous episode. After Charlemagne, 9th century bishops and local church councils called for the opening of schools. This was the great age of the copying of Latin manuscripts from the ancient world. Kenneth Clark is the author of the great classic book called Civilization, and he says this. He said, people don't always realize that only 3 or 4 antique manuscripts of the Latin authors are still in existence. Our whole knowledge of ancient literature is due to the collecting and copying that began under Charlemagne, and almost any classical text that survived until the 8th century has survived until today. Well, there's something to credit the Church with, don't you think? In fact, the 8th and 9th centuries saw the beginnings that were unfortunately snuffed out, of a kind of cultural revival that was known as the Carolingian Renaissance. And here we saw the attempt to bring back learning and culture. And we see, for instance, the copying of manuscripts, which is important. We see, in addition to that, the development of something called Carolingian minuscule. Carolingian minuscule was a kind of writing. Before the existence of Carolingian minuscule, you would see writing that had only capital letters. And if you ever get an email from somebody who sends you an email in only capital letters and you just can't bear to look at it, you know, who is this barbarian writing to me in all caps? It's annoying, it's hard to read, it takes longer to write. They also had no spaces between the words before Carolingian minuscule, no punctuation. So imagine just a big block of capital letters. That's a lot of fun to read. Beyond that, because of geographical isolation, people in this part of Europe, rather than this part of Europe, would develop their own script that was largely indecipherable to people from another part of Europe, whereas it was monks who helped develop what was called Carolingian minuscule. Minuscule because it introduced the idea of lowercase letters. It also introduced spaces between the words, punctuation, and it constituted a single script, a single standardized kind of writing, so that people could travel throughout Western Europe and could understand each other. Well, that's no small contribution. That's one of the great contributions to the cause of literacy in the world. And that came out of this Carolingian Renaissance. Unfortunately, the Carolingian Renaissance died a premature death, largely because of more waves of invasion by still other barbarian groups. The 9th and 10th centuries, the 800s and 900s, saw wave upon wave of invasions by various groups, by the Muslims, by the Magyars, and by the Vikings. And these waves of invasion were devastating to the West. Monasteries were sacked and destroyed, as were centers of learning. Now, Western Europeans were often very, very good fighters, but they also tended to be very slow to organize. So by the time they could get themselves together, the raid was all over and they'd been sacked. And this happened year after year. Well, it's not the Church's fault if it's hard to maintain civilization when the Vikings are attacking you every single year. And when we consider that one of the best known of these attackers was a man named Thorfinn Skullsplitter, we can get a little flavor of what this must have been like to live at that time. And yet, the monasteries of the Catholic Church had incredible staying power. They were among the most resilient institutions that ever existed, because you can destroy one of them, but there's still hundreds more, and even if you destroy all but one, the one can restore the culture. Christopher Dawson was one of the great Catholic historians of the 20th century. For a while he taught at Harvard. That's never going to happen again, but Christopher Dawson taught at Harvard, and he said, among other things, he said, 99 out of 100 monasteries could be burnt and the monks killed or driven out, and yet the whole tradition could be constituted from the one survivor. And the desolate sites could be repeopled by fresh supplies of monks who would take up again the broken tradition, following the same rule, singing the same liturgy, reading the same books and thinking the same thoughts as their predecessors. Well, if you want to revive a civilization, having monasteries around certainly doesn't hurt, does it? So the monasteries, as we'll see, as I say in another episode, played an indispensable role. They could, no matter how many of them you destroyed, it could start all over again because of the remnants. Now, historian Lowry Daly once said that the Catholic Church was the only institution in Europe that showed consistent interest in the preservation and cultivation of knowledge. Isn't that surprising to hear a historian say that? The Catholic Church is the only institution that's consistently interested in the cultivation and preservation of knowledge and the pursuit of truth. Well, it so happens that that institution, the Catholic Church, did more than any other institution to give birth to the university system in Europe. The university was a unique creation of the High Middle Ages in Europe. And when we say High Middle Ages, we typically mean perhaps 1150 to 1200, all the way to perhaps 1350 or 1300, that time period. And it's an extraordinary time because, as I say, it gives birth to the university system. How could you call an age dark that gives us the universities? Now, where did the universities come from? Where did the universities come from? All different sources. In fact, they come from On the one hand, some of the universities, some of the cathedral schools that were built and encouraged by Charlemagne and later bishops, some of them turned into universities. Other universities got started as informal gatherings of scholars that eventually built up the infrastructure of a university. And we can't identify with exact precision a date that they got started, but certainly we can say that by the latter half of the 12th century into the 1200s, the universities are getting going. And you start to see some of the great universities of the Western tradition. You see the birth of Oxford and Cambridge and Paris and Bologna and the medical school at Salerno. These places are 800 years old and older in some cases. This is an extraordinary advance. And what institution made it possible? Not simply the Catholic Church, but specifically the papacy. Henri Daniel Rops was a French historian in the 20th century who said, thanks to the repeated intervention of the papacy, higher education was enabled to extend its boundaries. The Church, in fact, was the matrix that produced the university, the nest whence it took flight. The popes, for example, chartered more universities than anybody else in Europe. But they did more than that. They didn't just establish universities. They fostered and protected them. They extended all kinds of benefits to universities that made it possible for them to function and survive and indeed to flourish. Sometimes, I'll just say this before we go to our break, we who live in a university town, I live in a university town, I'm not going to tell you, I don't want to hurt any feelings, but we sometimes love the money the students bring to the town, but we can't stand the students because they're so rowdy and noisy. That happened in the Middle Ages too, and the popes protected the students from sometimes the abuse of the townsmen. Let's see how he did it after we come back with the Church, builder of civilization. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Before the break, we were looking at the development of the university system in Western civilization and noting that the Catholic Church played a larger role than any other institution in spreading knowledge, cultivating the pursuit of knowledge, and allowing the university system to blossom. There was no institution that did more, and the papacy in particular consistently intervened. Now, right away, as early as the 1200s, as the universities are forming, we already see the characteristics of modern universities. They were not absolutely identical to our modern universities, but we see important similarities. For instance, that we had the same distinction between graduate and undergraduate education that we have now. We had the idea that you go and you pursue a fixed course of study, upon the completion of which you receive a degree. All these things were features of the medieval university. Now, in the ancient world, they had schools, of course, they had academies, but they didn't have quite these features that I've described. And typically, if you belonged to an ancient academy, it meant that you belonged to the school of thought that dominated that academy. Whereas in the medieval university, there was no reigning school of thought. Instead, you had vigorous debate back and forth on a variety of subjects. But just before we went to the break, I specifically pointed to the role of the popes. How did the popes help to foster the universities, apart from chartering more universities than anybody? The popes also extended the benefit of clergy to students. Benefit of clergy is a privilege that was extended typically, of course, to clergymen, which said that if you were to harm a clergyman, it would be considered an especially heinous offense. Also, benefit of clergy meant that if you were a clergyman, you could have your case heard in a church court rather than a local secular court. Well, this benefit was extended to the students at universities because, as I suggested at the break, Sometimes the local townspeople didn't really like the students, just the way they are today. A lot of people today look at the university students and they say, I like the fact that they've brought Mom and Dad's money to my town and they're ready to spend it on all kinds of ridiculous nonsense. However, I don't like the fact that they keep knocking over my mailbox. I mean, why would you get pleasure out of knocking over my mailbox? This sort of thing. People love the money and they hate the students. That's exactly how they felt in the Middle Ages. So sometimes the students would find themselves being hauled into some local court on trumped-up charges and just being harassed in general. The Pope prevented that from happening and allowed the life of the university to flourish by extending benefit of clergy to the students. Any time there was any need to intervene in the university system, if there was some kind of problem, people knew you appeal to the Pope and he will resolve it. In fact, on numerous occasions, the Pope had to intervene to ensure that the professors' salaries were being paid. Now think of how pro-Catholic European universities would be today if Pope Benedict could do that, if he could intervene and get them a raise or something. Well, anyway, those days are gone. However, it is important to recognize that among the universities that were chartered by the Pope, there was something called, in Latin, and I'm using the church pronunciation, ius ubique docendi, which literally means the right of teaching everywhere. What that means is that if you got a degree at a university that the Pope had founded, had given its charter to, that you had the right, automatically, no questions asked, to go to any university in Western Europe and begin teaching. No questions asked. So that begins to foster the idea of an international scholarly community, because somebody coming from this university can just go and teach over at this one. And we begin to get fruitful intellectual exchange. Now, some people, I'm sure, have a sort of caricatured view of what intellectual life must have been like in a medieval university because, for instance, it's sometimes said that, oh, of course we had universities, but the professors had to toe the line, right? They had to say whatever the bishop wanted them to say, or the Pope, or they were always hemmed in and they couldn't just say what they wanted to say. That is so false that it would take forever to refute it. To the contrary, as any impartial historian of the universities will tell you, to the contrary, the intellectual life of these universities was very vigorous and robust. There was hardly any question that was not rigorously debated at the medieval university. Now, it's true, there were broad theological limits within which this debate took place, but within those limits, it was open season for various questions being debated. I mean, arguably, there was more rigorous debate in medieval universities than there are when we see in universities today. I mean, in universities today, we all know you have to walk on eggshells, you're not allowed to say certain things, or you're not allowed to defend certain types of people or defend the Catholic Church. We all know that. You didn't have that in the medieval university. You had rigorous, vigorous debate going on back and forth. In fact, what you would see in the afternoons after the professors would give their morning lectures was that a professor would get up before the entire assembled university community and he would do something called determine a question. That is to say, some controversial question would be debated by skilled debaters on both sides of that matter. And they would both make the strongest cases they could for their own positions. And then it would be up to the professor to step forward and synthesize everything that had just been heard and put it all together and resolve it, come to a solution on the basis of this rigorous debate. That was called determining a question, and that took place in the afternoons. Now, I would like to see a modern university try something like that, but you won't see it because the professors are all tenured and they want to just sit in their offices and type entries on their blogs, so they're not going to want to do that. But that was what the university system was like, and if you wanted to get a degree in a medieval university, you had to do that too. You as a student had to stand up there in front of the whole university community and determine a question. That's hard. That's difficult. Now consider also that we can see the debating nature of our Western civilization. We can see it evident in the writings of this time, the writings of the early centuries of the university. Take, for example, the great St. Thomas Aquinas, who is admired by all civilized people everywhere, in effect. Who is admired by all civilized people everywhere, in effect. Look at St. Thomas. Look at the way he debated with people. First of all, if you look at his Summa Theologiae, or Summa Theologica, you see that it's arranged according to questions and answers. Thousands of questions he raises. Incidentally, I used to put on my quizzes, yes, I'm admitting on camera that I gave multiple choice quizzes at the college level. I did that just to make sure they read their books, which they didn't, but I gave them the quizzes all the same. And one of the wrong answers I gave was, the church told people not to ask questions. Now, if you were even slightly listening to anything I was saying, there's no way you'd circle that answer. You wouldn't believe how many of them would circle it. I could have spent the whole semester standing up there saying the church fosters a culture in which questions were routinely asked. Wouldn't have made any difference. They've already been told the church hates knowledge. And so they all circled the wrong answer. Well, in any event, St. Thomas Aquinas asked question after question after question. And if you notice the style of his writing, you notice the organization of it, he and other scholastics debated things in this way. They would take some question, and then they would consider all the possible objections to their own position and list them out. And then they would explain their own position. And then they'd go back and they'd answer the objections. And he did this for question after question after question. It's an extraordinary achievement. It's fascinating reading. And what's great about it is that St. Thomas was generous toward his opponents. St. Thomas wouldn't just make up some ridiculous argument, attribute it to his opponents, and then say, aha, I triumphantly answer this person. No, he would present his opponent's arguments as persuasively as he could. At least try to make it a little interesting, right? He would portray it as accurately as possible and as persuasively as possible. In fact, in some cases, St. Thomas would even think up arguments that his own opponents hadn't even thought of. And he would say, well, wait a minute, you guys also have this argument and this one. I'll give you those, and then he'd answer those. I mean, that is an honest debater. That's what Western intellectual life was like. And you see it in St. Thomas. It's organized in effect, the format of a debate, an ongoing debate with antagonists. That is an extraordinary achievement. That is what our Western civilization is about. It's not just uniformity, it's debate and discussion. Now, one of the great historians of science in our day is a man named Edward Grant. And he looked back at these medieval universities not long ago, and he found something very, very important there. And he said this, he said, what made it possible for Western civilization to develop science and the social sciences in a way that no other civilization had ever done before? The answer, I am convinced, lies in a pervasive and deep-seated spirit of inquiry that was a natural consequence of the emphasis on reason that began in the Middle Ages. With the exception of revealed truths, reason was enthroned in medieval universities as the ultimate arbiter for most intellectual arguments and controversies. It was quite natural for scholars immersed in a university environment to employ reason, to probe into subject areas that had not been explored before, as well as to discuss possibilities that had not previously been seriously entertained. And Professor Grant went on to say that the commitment to reason and rational discussion that we see in the Middle Ages and that we see in our modern world, this is one of the great gifts of the Latin Middle Ages to our world. But nobody knows about it. And he said it must, unfortunately, remain one of the best-kept secrets of the past hundreds of years. Isn't that astonishing? We shouldn't keep it a secret, however. We should go around telling people about this, because it's an extraordinary aspect of our civilization. Let's just end with St. Anselm, for example, is another example of what I'm talking about. St. Anselm, although he lived just before the universities were getting started, but he had the same spirit of rational inquiry. St. Anselm, for instance, had a book in Latin, Cur Deus Homo, which has been usually rendered in English as Why the God-Man, or Why Did God Become Man? Because St. Anselm used purely rational argument to try to consider, why did God do the extraordinary? Why did he become man and dwell among us? If he wished to reconcile the human race to himself, why did he not simply make a declaration from heaven? Why did he become man? And St. Anselm explained this by using his own reason, thinking about it. But what St. Anselm is known for the most, perhaps, among philosophers, is that he asked another rational question: does God exist? And he began to use reason to try to uncover the answer to that question. Does God exist? St. Thomas picked up this question, of course, and he had 5 ways that he used to demonstrate that God existed. And this is where we're going to pick up next time, because this intellectual tradition of debate and discussion and reason turns itself on the faith itself and asks questions like, does God exist? And if so, can we demonstrate it? And I'm going to suggest that they did it. How did they do it? We'll see next time on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. See you then.